The blue cloth path stretched from Westminster Hall to the Abbey steps, damp with the breath of 1,000 spectators. Beneath her, the fabric was cut to shreds by grasping hands the moment she passed, as if pilgrims might steal virtue from the hem of her presence. The coronation was not merely a ceremony, it was an exorcism, not of devils, but of memory. 3 crowns were placed upon her head. Not one fit. One was too heavy with her father's sins. One, a phantom echo of her mother's ruin. And the last hollow, gold-gilded silence for the child who had once wept alone in the tower. The bishops anointed her with oil in 7 places, not unlike the 7 wounds her lineage had carved into her skin. The palms, the breasts, the shoulder blades, the crown of her head. It was not sanctification, it was branding. When she stood from her knees, all England saw a queen. But inside her corseted flesh stood something else the last Tudor crowned in survival. Not innocence. She was not born to rule. She had been born to scandal, raised in suspicion, molded by exile, and now married not to a man, but to a kingdom that had nearly executed her. The crowd cheered. They did not know the child had once written her final words with shaking hands, believing she would never leave the tower alive. They did not know the cold kiss of betrayal that came not from enemies, but family. They did not know Thomas Seymour. Her reign would come to symbolize balance, the Virgin Queen, unwed, untouched, untouchable, yet dangerously fluent in seduction. But it did not begin in majesty. It began in ruin. She was 3 when her mother, Anne Boleyn, was beheaded. The sword had cut more than flesh. It had severed Elizabeth's legitimacy, erased her from the line of succession, and left her a bastard. At her christening, the font had been warmed with fire. By the time she reached the throne, she had learned never to trust warmth. It always burned. So when she accepted the crown, Elizabeth did not smile. She did not cry. She looked toward the altar stone, ancient and indifferent, and gripped the ring placed on her finger, a symbol of mystical marriage to England itself. A virgin wed to a nation that had once tried to bury her beneath it. The archbishop whispered Latin. But it was not divine will that brought her here. It was cunning, restraint, a refusal to die. This was not triumph, it was return. And return always means something was taken. But to understand how she returned, you must first understand how she was taken again and again from her names, her mother, her crown, her safety, and nearly her life. You must return to the little girl with flame-red hair, watching from the shadows as her mother walked toward the executioner's blade. You must see the child too clever for her own protection, punished for speaking Latin too well, for questioning too sharply, for surviving too long. You must follow her through 1,000 locked doors, each opened by treachery and slammed shut by men who swore they loved her. You must watch her write, again and again, to kings and queens who did not trust her, with hands trained for diplomacy, but trembling from fear. You must hear her silence, because silence, for her, was the only weapon no man could confiscate. Before she was England's monarch, Elizabeth was England's mirror, showing it everything it had tried to forget: its religious violence, its lust for blood, its obsession with female purity, and its fear of women who did not break. Now she wore the crown, but it was not the end. It was only the beginning of her fight to keep it. She was born on a promise and baptized in a lie. September of 1533 had brought not the long-awaited son Henry VIII demanded, but a daughter, red-haired, sharp-eyed, already carrying the disappointment of a kingdom in her breath. Elizabeth Tudor entered a world not built for her survival. The astrologers had been certain. The court had already drafted the pronouncements for a prince. The royal midwives had prepared hot water for the font, and the musicians had tuned their instruments for triumph. But when Anne Boleyn bore a girl, the songs were stifled. and the joy turned bitter. Still, the ceremony went ahead. Robes, processions, gilded prayers, as if performance could overwrite reality. Yet beneath every ritual was a subtle crack the imperial ambassador refused to attend. The papal legate offered no blessing, and whispers trailed through the chapel like smoke from a dying fire. A priest was asked whether the child had been baptized in hot water or cold. He replied, "Hot, but not hot enough." The jest stung, because it was true. Elizabeth's arrival was a fracture in the myth of Tudor invincibility. And though she was crowned with words Princess of England, those syllables would soon dissolve like frost on glass. Her mother's triumph was brief. Anne Boleyn had promised the king not just a child, but a dynasty. When she failed to produce a son, her worth always conditional collapsed into suspicion. 2 miscarriages followed, then the final stillbirth. By May 1536, Anne was arrested and accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Even her own brother was named among her lovers. The trials were swift, the verdicts predetermined. Elizabeth was barely 3 when she was led to the Tower Green to watch her mother's fate. Of that day, Elizabeth would speak nothing. Not once, but silence is not forgetfulness, it is how children survive unbearable truths. The sword fell in one stroke. Mercy. They called it a French-style execution rather than the blunt English axe. But mercy means nothing to the child left behind. From that day forward, Elizabeth would carry her mother's phantom like a hidden limb never mentioned, never visible, always aching. In the aftermath, her identity shattered. The royal documents were amended. She was no longer Princess Elizabeth, heir to the English throne. She became the Lady Elizabeth, a bastard without legal standing or future. Her household was dismantled. Her clothing was too small. Her meals uncertain. Lady Bryan, her governess, wrote in desperation to the King's Council the girl had outgrown all her gowns, had no proper food, and no clarity on her place in court. Even this mundane appeal, more cloth. Simpler meals was laced with dread. For a child declared illegitimate, even growing taller could become a political threat. Yet Elizabeth did not complain. Even then, she had begun to master her first and greatest defense endurance without protest. What set her apart from other displaced royals was not her bloodline, but her mind. By the age of 4, she had begun formal education in the classical tradition: Latin, Greek, French, Italian. But these were not offered as ornaments. Her tutors trained her in double translation from Latin to English, and back again, word for word, until the structure of meaning itself was memorized. This was not mere scholarship. It was discipline. Language was control. Syntax was armor. Each perfectly reconstructed sentence was an act of survival, a way to maintain composure in a world built on shifting alliances and lethal uncertainty. The girl who watched her mother die was also the girl who learned how to translate grief into order, exile into strategy, silence into precision. Still, there was a cruel irony in her brilliance. No matter how elegantly she translated Cicero or corrected her tutor's syntax, she remained the daughter of a disgraced queen. England remembered, and so did Henry. Though he rarely saw her, he kept Elizabeth at a distance, sending messengers on feast days and gifts without affection. Her replies, even as a child, were measured, formal, bordering on eerily adult. One envoy described her gratitude as with as great a gravity as if she were 40 years old. Childhood, for her, was not a phase. It was a test, and every day she passed it by not being noticed, not being troublesome, not giving cause for removal. Her fortunes shifted briefly with the arrival of her stepmother, Catherine Parr. Catherine was devout, intelligent, and more than a little intrigued by the precocious daughter of Anne Boleyn. She encouraged Elizabeth's studies, hosted her in court, and even inspired her to compose New Year's gifts for the king, handwritten, multilingual letters bound in embroidered velvet. One such gift, given when Elizabeth was 12, still survives: Latin, French, Italian, all in immaculate penmanship, with no corrections, no smudges, no doubts. The final letter addressed Henry as matchless and most kind father, a phrase carefully chosen to praise without presumption. Even in love, Elizabeth calculated. Yet behind the Latin conjugations and courtly performances, danger was already circling. When Catherine married Thomas Seymour, the king's brother-in-law and uncle to the boy king, Edward, Elizabeth came to live under their roof. She was 14. Seymour was 40. History calls it inappropriate. Reality was darker. He teased her, tickled her, crept into her chambers before dawn. One day he cut her black gown to ribbons while Catherine held her down, laughing. Another time, he tickled her in bed while she pretended to sleep. Catherine's complicity, whether from denial or desire to please her new husband, gave him cover. Elizabeth played along, sometimes coy, sometimes frightened. But in truth, she was learning. Not about men. She had already understood men. She was learning about power, the kind that wore the mask of affection while seeking to consume. The scandal exploded after Catherine's death in childbirth. Seymour, now a widower, proposed marriage to Elizabeth. She did not say yes. She did not say no. Instead, she deferred to the council, to her elders, to a future moment that never arrived. It was enough to save her. When Seymour was arrested for treason, caught sneaking into the boy king's bedchamber with a drawn sword, Elizabeth too came under suspicion. Her closest servant, Cat Ashley, was imprisoned. Her letters were seized. Rumors circulated that she was pregnant. She wrote to the Lord Protector, protesting her innocence, decrying shameful slanders. And then she did nothing more. No plea, no outburst, no confession, just silence. This was Elizabeth's turning point, not a single moment, but a slow coagulation of realizations. That charm was dangerous. That beauty could be used against her. That intelligence must be cloaked in humility. That love was a luxury. But suspicion was a shield. She had survived the tower once as a child. She would never allow herself to return, not as a prisoner, not as a pawn, not as a woman ruled by the whims of others. From now on, she would dress simply, speak carefully, and trust no one fully. She would not be owned, not even by affection. She was no longer the girl forgotten by her father. She was the bastard daughter who had outlived the sins of her name and turned them into armor. The world Elizabeth inherited after the death of her father was not a court, but a labyrinth, a palace of mirrors where loyalty turned with the wind, and every act of kindness bore the shadow of calculation. She was 13 when Henry VIII died, and the court, once familiar, however cold, rearranged itself with the unnatural speed of power unchecked. Her half-brother, Edward VI, a boy of 9, ascended the throne, and in his name, others began to rule. Elizabeth's title, wealth, and even her body became currency in the quiet war of factions that circled the child king like hawks. At the heart of this struggle stood two men, Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, and his younger brother, Thomas, the man Elizabeth had once called guardian, who had once crept into her chambers, laughing as he whispered beneath her sheets. Now Seymour was no longer just a man with wandering hands. He was a man with ambition. And Elizabeth, even in adolescence, was a stepping stone toward his imagined throne. To love her, he thought, was to claim her. To claim her was to claim England. And Elizabeth understood this all too well. There are no gentle seasons in a court ruled by children and governed by predators. Elizabeth, having narrowly escaped the wreckage of Seymour's scandal, began to distance herself not only from danger, but from dependency. She retreated to Hatfield, a quiet country estate where the air was sharp and clean, and the walls did not listen. There she read with fervor Scripture, Seneca, Erasmus, Tertullian, and practiced the art of self-erasure. The elaborate gowns were left in closets. Jewels remained locked. She studied in plain linen, with hair unadorned, her face unpainted, as if to deny the world every chance it might take to define her. After the ruin of Seymour, she wore invisibility like a second skin, but it was never weakness. It was retreat, the retreat of a strategist, not a victim. Among her tutors was Roger Ascham, a man who had taught princes and poets alike, but none, he would later write, shone brighter than Elizabeth. He described her mind as exempt from female weakness, not in contempt of womanhood, but in reverence for the force within her that defied every expectation of it. Her mind was not docile. It was flame, sharpened by grief and fueled by a need not to be adored, but to be safe. Ascham's letters recall how she devoured languages not merely to understand others, but to dismantle them, to peel back the false civility of foreign diplomacy and expose the naked will beneath. When she translated Greek tragedy, she read not as an innocent learning virtue, but as a survivor identifying danger. Euripides' Medea, Seneca's Thyestes, these were not academic exercises. They were mirrors, and each word committed to memory was another nail driven into the coffin of naivete. But the court, always hungering for distraction, would not let her disappear. Under Edward's Protestant rule, Elizabeth's faith became both shield and signal. She aligned herself with the new religion not loudly, not with sermons or proclamations, but with the soft, stubborn gestures of the defiant. She refused to cross herself. She carried no rosary. When the Mass was read, she stood apart, still and inscrutable. The religious transformation of England had never been purely spiritual. It was a weapon. The ashes of martyrs were still warm when Elizabeth learned how to navigate the pyres with her silence. The Protestants saw her as an icon of reform. The Catholics saw her as a threat. But Elizabeth refused to speak for either side. To her, truth was not in ritual, but in restraint. Then came the winter of 1553, and with it, the collapse of every safeguard she had built. Edward, just 15, was dying, consumed by sickness, delirium, and the weight of dynastic paranoia. Fearing the return of Catholicism through his sister Mary, he tried to rewrite the succession, bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of the Protestant Lady Jane Grey. But blood has its own gravity. The people, weary of experiments in inheritance, rallied to Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. The army rose in her name. Lady Jane Grey reigned 9 days and then no more. Elizabeth watched the fall from a distance, surrounded by her armed retainers at Hatfield, waiting for the verdict of history. It arrived, as it always did, cloaked in ceremony and blood. Mary was proclaimed queen. Jane was imprisoned and, months later, beheaded. Elizabeth rode beside Mary into London, the cheers of the crowd indistinguishable from the sound of gallows being built. Mary's reign began in triumph and descended into suspicion, though Elizabeth had supported her sister publicly, though she had wept and bent the knee and kissed the crucifix. Her Protestant leanings made her dangerous in the eyes of those who now wielded the fires of the Inquisition. At first, she was ordered to attend Mass. She refused, citing illness. Then she pleaded ignorance. Then she begged for time. It was not faith that troubled her, it was the memory of how faith was enforced. Elizabeth understood that the prayers of tyrants always smell of smoke. Mary, perhaps feeling the flicker of threat, relented briefly. But by 1554, rebellion once more stirred. Thomas Wyatt, furious at Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain, raised an army to oppose the union. Though Elizabeth's involvement was never proven, the suspicion was enough. She was summoned to court, interrogated, then imprisoned at Whitehall. Finally, the order came. She was to be taken to the Tower. They gave her the news on a grey morning. Rain fell like judgment as she wrote a final letter to the Queen, a plea not just for mercy, but for justice. She wrote as if she had days to live. Her handwriting, once practiced and elegant, began to falter halfway down the second page. Corrections crept in, then hesitation, then, in a flourish of desperation, she filled the remaining space with long diagonal slashes to prevent any additions, as if even her paper might be betrayed. The letter bought her one night. No more. The tide was too high. The next morning, they led her down the river. To walk into the Tower of London as a prisoner is to walk into memory. She had last seen it as a child, when her mother was beheaded. Now she walked in, not as a spectator, but as prey. When the guards bowed and whispered, "God save your grace," she did not believe them. She knew too well the pattern of false reverence, but she held her head high. "I come here no traitor," she told the silent stones, but as true a subject to her majesty as any alive. And then the gates closed. For 8 weeks, she remained within those walls. Her fate balanced on the breath of her sister. It was not kindness that saved her, but calculation. Mary, though fierce in her convictions, knew that to kill Elizabeth without proof would fracture her reign beyond repair. The fires had already begun. Protestants burned alive, their screams echoing in public squares. To add Elizabeth's blood to the flames would make her a martyr. Instead, Mary exiled her to Woodstock, under guard, under watch, with no freedom of movement, no visitors, no trust. Her jailer, Sir Henry Bedingfield, kept the keys close to his chest and the gates locked. Elizabeth called him "my jailer," not in jest, but as a prophecy. Every day, she paced the gardens under supervision. Every night, she read by candlelight with one ear tuned to footsteps. But she survived, quietly, diligently, like a shadow learning how to become substance. By the time she was summoned back to court, the court itself had changed. Mary's phantom pregnancy had ended in humiliation. Her Spanish husband, Philip, showed no love, and the fires that were meant to purify England had begun to consume it. Elizabeth, returning from the margins, said little. She dressed modestly. She smiled faintly. She bowed deeply, but those who watched closely saw something different behind her eyes, a knowing, steady refusal to break. She had been among wolves, and she had learned to walk like one. By 1555, the air in England had begun to thicken with ash. The Marian regime, swollen with its own righteousness, had turned persecution into policy. Flames erupted across the countryside, not from rebellion, but from pyres built for men and women whose only crime was the wrong prayer in the wrong tongue. More than 300 were condemned in just under 4 years. The executions were not swift, they were not clean. Gunpowder was sometimes tied to the ankles of the condemned, a final act of kindness to hasten death. But when that mercy failed, or was denied, the screams dragged on, dissolving into guttural shrieks that settled into the bones of the watching crowds. The strategy, if it could be called that, was simple: terror would purify. But terror, Elizabeth understood, did not purify, it calcified. It burned into memory, into legend, into resistance. And it was into this England, blood-hot with fear and holiness, that Elizabeth re-emerged not yet as queen, but as symbol, as heir, and above all, as threat. She did not speak against the fires. That would have been suicide, nor did she speak for them. That would have been betrayal. Instead, she lived as a study in paradox, present, but distant, compliant, but untouched. She was seen at court, bowed when expected, smiled as needed. Her garments were restrained, somber fabrics, no excessive jewelry, no crimson that might provoke whispers of her mother. She wore black and gray, as if mourning not a person, but a nation. Her hair, once a golden flame, was pulled tightly from her face, her expressions measured into stillness. She became a mirror, and in her reflection, people saw what they needed: stability, continuity, survival. But underneath the restraint, her silence was loaded with awareness. She saw Mary unraveling, sickened by disappointment, broken by the phantom child that never came, abandoned by the Spanish husband whose coldness was mistaken for formality but was simply indifference. The court around Mary fractured, filled with spies, confessions, and the faint smell of smoke embedded in velvet robes. Philip of Spain, pragmatic and cold, had begun to view Elizabeth not as an enemy, but as a solution. If Mary could not bear a child, Elizabeth would inherit. And what better way to control England than through her? His advisors proposed a Catholic match, a marriage to a foreign prince, perhaps the Duke of Savoy, someone pliant, someone who would keep England tethered to the papal throne. Elizabeth approached through intermediaries, feigned interest. She asked questions. She delayed responses. She insisted on conditions. She did not refuse. Refusal was a blade. Delay, however, was a labyrinth, and no man could find the center of it. When Philip's courtiers pressed for an answer, she developed a sudden and suspicious fever, rendering her conveniently too ill to decide. Those around her learned quickly that illness, for Elizabeth, was not weakness, it was strategy. But even strategy cannot forestall time. In the summer of 1558, Mary's body began to betray her with undeniable clarity. The monarch who had once paraded through London with her head held high now stumbled through corridors, hollowed and pale, haunted by visions of children who would never be born, and fires that would not cleanse her reign. Her council urged her to name a successor. She refused. They insisted. She wept. They brought her reports of the people's mood, how even Catholics began to question the Queen's silence on the matter. Reluctantly, perhaps brokenly, she agreed. 10 days before her death, Elizabeth was summoned to court. No fanfare greeted her, no choir sang. She arrived under gray skies to a palace quieter than a tomb. On November 17th, 1558, Mary Tudor died. Elizabeth did not cry. She did not smile. Those closest to her remembered only that she walked alone into the gardens of Hatfield, gloves clutched in her hand, lips unmoving. And then, kneeling beneath an old oak tree, she whispered the words of Psalm 118, "A domino factum est istud et est mirabile in oculis nostris." This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. But no divine intervention had carried her to the throne. Only endurance had, and cunning, and the stubborn refusal to die where others had perished. Her coronation would be planned in detail. But at that moment, kneeling in mud beneath fading leaves, there was no crown, only memory and the long breath of someone who had not expected to outlive her enemies. London prepared itself. It had waited decades for stability and feared it would never arrive. The capital, once blackened by plague and pyres, now burst into chaotic color. Nobles returned from exile. The bells of Westminster rang until the metal cracked. Crowds gathered at bridges, in alleys, on rooftops. They did not come for theology. They came for survival. They did not know what Elizabeth believed, nor did they care. What they wanted was a monarch who would not set them on fire. What they hoped for was someone who could remember grief without reenacting it. Elizabeth gave them what they needed: composure, promise, distance. When she entered the city, she was no longer the Lady Elizabeth. She was majesty incarnate, and she walked not as a woman, but as a symbol of continuity, of restrained strength, of a new era. Yet coronation was not closure. It was choreography. Elizabeth chose January 15, 1559, after consulting the astrologer John Dee, a man more feared than trusted. His charts declared it an auspicious day, and Elizabeth, ever careful to blend tradition with spectacle, followed the stars. The procession moved from Westminster Hall to the Abbey and along the blue cloth carpet. Commoners leaned down to cut scraps of the fabric as relics. Elizabeth walked slowly, her train held high, her eyes unwavering. 3 crowns would be placed upon her head, each heavier than the last, each, perhaps, symbolic of a different chain. She had survived the crown of blood. For her mother, the crown of fire, for her sister, and finally, the crown of silence earned not through war, but by outlasting everyone who once thought her weak. When the oil touched her skin, it burned not physically, but with memory. She was anointed on the palms, the breast, the back, the head. 7 places, 7 wounds. A ritual inherited from men who never feared what power would do to a woman's body. As the ring was slid onto her finger, symbolizing a mystical marriage to the realm, the Archbishop's voice trembled. Perhaps he too remembered how close she had come to never reaching this altar. And when she turned to face the congregation, Elizabeth did not smile. She looked out, as she had always done, not for love, not for admiration, but for danger. To the watching world, she was now untouchable. But Elizabeth knew better. The crown was not armor. It was invitation, a promise to serve, but also a target. And though she had survived fire, sword, and shame, she would have to survive something even more insidious now: the expectations of a divided realm and the eternal scrutiny of those who still doubted a woman could rule. She had worn the chains of illegitimacy, the chains of suspicion, the chains of survival. Now she wore a golden one, polished, regal, suffocating in its own way. And as the choir sang, and the trumpets blared, and the incense swirled, Elizabeth stood beneath the vaulted arches of Westminster Abbey, not as the innocent child of promise, not as the trembling prisoner of the Tower, but as a creature utterly remade, not by grace, not by love, but by fire. The throne, now hers, did not offer comfort, it offered only clarity. Elizabeth knew from the first day she wore the crown that monarchy was not majesty, it was containment. A sovereign must learn not to be ruled by others, but more importantly, not to be ruled by herself. There could be no indulgence, no slips of the heart, no flickers of desire left unexamined. If her sister Mary had ruled with the agony of her womb, Elizabeth would rule with the precision of her restraint. Love, marriage, heirs, these were the expectations forced upon her from every corner of Europe. But Elizabeth had seen too many women consumed by the men they married. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, once the brightest flame at court, had been extinguished by the very man who claimed to worship her. Catherine Howard, another of Henry's doomed wives, had died for her youth and her secrets. Even Catherine Parr, the woman Elizabeth had once trusted, had died giving birth to the child of a man who had groped at her stepdaughter's virtue. Elizabeth understood the equation clearly. Marriage was not sanctuary, it was surrender, and she would never surrender again. The council, predictably, pressed. Within weeks of her coronation, suggestions were made polite at first, then fervent. Foreign envoys arrived bearing portraits, promises, political alliances dressed in velvet and pearl, the Archduke Charles of Austria, Prince Eric of Sweden, the Duke of Anjou, even Philip of Spain, her late sister's husband, sent overtures through diplomatic back channels. Elizabeth responded to each with impeccable courtesy and maddening vagueness. She called herself a mere woman, poor in judgment, in need of time. But time was exactly what she used to disarm them. When one suitor sent a ring to symbolize their hoped-for union, she replied by wearing it publicly on the wrong hand. She praised their qualities, thanked their embassies, and never committed. Each letter, each courtship, was treated not as a matter of love, but of statecraft. She flirted with nations the way other women flirted with men, strategically, non-committally, without giving an inch more than necessary. At home, the pressure was worse. Her advisors begged her to marry. England, they warned, needed an heir. Without a child, the Tudor line would fracture. Catholic exiles abroad whispered of alternative claimants. But Elizabeth would not bend to biological panic. "I'm already bound unto a husband," she told Parliament. "The kingdom of England shall be my spouse." It was a statement met with applause. Then unease. What monarch had ever ruled alone and lasted? What woman had dared remain single without becoming a scandal? Elizabeth saw the doubt in their faces, the silent accusation behind their cheers, but she would not be moved. For her, the idea of virginity was not moral, not religious, it was political. To remain untouched was to remain untethered. It meant no husband could dominate her policy. No foreign prince could claim her body. No faction could seize her through conjugal alliance. Virginity, for Elizabeth, was power. Yet she was no stone. She was not without affection, nor without need. Her court, though regulated by ritual and hierarchy, became a stage for carefully chosen favorites. Robert Dudley, the childhood companion who had risen beside her through the flames of political misfortune, stood closest. He was tall, charismatic, and married then suddenly widowed. Under mysterious and suspicious circumstances, whispers followed him like shadows, and when his wife was found dead at the bottom of a staircase, Elizabeth was forced to retreat. The love, if it was love, could not survive scrutiny. Dudley remained at court, given titles, favors, chambers near her own. But marriage was denied. It always would be. As her reign deepened, Elizabeth learned to balance herself between contradiction and myth. She styled herself in armor during battle speeches, in elaborate gowns during public procession, in black robes during times of mourning. Her image was curated with the precision of an artist and the cunning of a survivor. The portraits, commissioned and copied, all bore the same language: porcelain skin, ageless features, a gaze that looked past the viewer into some distant, unreachable truth. The Virgin Queen was not merely unmarried, she was inaccessible. Her heart, like her realm, was sovereign, but solitude came with cost. Those closest to her sometimes dared to ask if she ever regretted her path. "I see no cause to marry," she would say, "for I am married already to a husband that neither flatters me nor wearies me." Still, her letters during lonely winters bear the imprints of something quieter, aching. Not weakness, not desire for rescue, but the human hunger for companionship without consequence. She longed, at times, for laughter not wrapped in politics, for conversation not shadowed by secrets. But she knew better. The price of her survival had been intimacy. There were moments when her performance faltered. Illness would strike during times of great pressure, headaches, fevers, strange fits of melancholy. Her physicians blamed her humors. Her ladies whispered of bad dreams. But in truth, Elizabeth's strength did not come from immunity to pain. It came from her refusal to let it rule her. She treated her body as she treated her kingdom to be governed. Each morning, she rose before dawn, had her face painted white to mask fatigue, dressed layer by layer in a ritual of command. The corset, the ruff, the jeweled collar, the girdle of daggers, all reminders that power was performance. Weakness, if permitted, became prophecy. In time, Her iconography eclipsed her reality. Children recited her speeches in schoolrooms. Poets compared her to goddesses. Even foreign courts began to fear her, not for her armies, but for her unpredictability. She became England itself beyond flesh, beyond reproach. And in that elevation, she achieved what no woman before her had. She redefined rule not by imitation of kings, but by annihilation of precedent. She was not Henry's daughter. She was not Anne's ghost. She was not Mary's opposite. She was Elizabeth, entirely. And when courtiers inquired, even late in life, about her thoughts on marriage, she would smile, measured and mysterious, and reply, "I have one mistress here, and no master," a sentence sharpened by every betrayal she had endured, every crown she had nearly lost, every man who had tried to fold her into his ambition. She had watched thrones be traded like dowries, seen queens silenced by the hands meant to protect them. She would not be counted among them. She would reign alone, die alone, and be remembered not as a woman who ruled, but as a ruler who happened to be a woman.